Hi, Kristen Atchison here, and we're going to finish up Chapter 4, Prenatal Development, by talking about teratogens. So here's the same table that we've looked at before, but you can see that when there are teratogens introduced, now we have information across the bottom of this table that says what will happen. So if we have really bad kinds of introductions in the period of the zygote and implantation, we'll have prenatal death. So if something doesn't go right there, that organism will not survive. In the embryonic period, we can still have prenatal death. It's not as often, but it can still happen. But we can also have really major structural abnormalities. So this will be major deformities in heart, lungs, appendages, palate. I mean, again, these would be large. Central nervous system doesn't fully form, things like that. And then in the fetal period, we really have more physiological defects and more minor structural abnormalities. So again, it really depends on kind of what is happening with the organism as to the outcome of that teratogen. So let's go back over critical and sensitive periods. So the traditional definition is that this is a period where the structure is highly plastic or that it's really subject to change. So plastic is just, if you think about stuff that's plastic, like plastic wrap, it's malleable, right? You can change it. You can mold it into different shapes. So a period, a critical period or sensitive period is going to be a period of development where that change we're really, really sensitive to that. So maybe a structure is really rapidly developing. And I'll show you a slide in a little bit and shows you really how quickly the fingers develop. And again, this is where that environmental influences really affect development. The other thing that's important about these is once that time period has passed, so once we're past hand development, the opportunity to develop that structure is lost, to develop it in the typical way. So again, it's kind of a path that development's on, and if you miss your exit, there's no going back. So once this critical period or sensitive period has passed, there's not a turnaround to go back and get that structure or get that part of development accounted for. So again, here's that slide I was alluding to. So we have picture A is 44 days after conception. And you see we have a hand, but we don't really have any fingers. 11 days later, and that's picture C, we have a fully formed hand. We have all the fingers. Now, they're clearly not done developing, but the structure is there. And so you see, and again, the period of even the first 6 days, you see those finger buds between day 44 on picture A, and day 50 on picture B really start to develop. And then those extra 5 days for C really almost finish that structure. So again, once we pass this period, you can't go back and develop a hand. So again, there's these periods of development, and for major structures, they're really very early on, where we have a lot going on, and so prenatal, a lot going on in prenatal development, and so these environmental influences really can have a big, big impact. So teratogens are any disease, drug, or any other environmental agent that can harm a developing embryo or fetus. So again, this really can be anything. It can be caused by disease, it can be caused by drugs, it can be caused by chemicals in the environment, it can be caused by any number of different things. And the impact really depends on the genotype and the constitution of that individual organism. So the thing about teratogens is they are not universally harmful. So if you look at the difference between alcohol consumption with pregnant women, you can have 2 women that have consumed the same amount of alcohol, or any other really teratogen, And you can see very different outcomes in how that organism is affected. So again, these are not universally harmful. There's not a one-to-one ratio. It's not if you have this, then this will happen. You see different outcomes. There's not this level of universality. They're also very species specific. So there'll be some drugs or agents or teratogens that will affect humans, but not affect other species. This becomes especially problematic when a lot of our drug studies are first being tested on animal models, even pregnant animal models. So, you know, in the case of one of the ones that we'll talk about in a little bit, thalidomide, it was not harmful at all in the animal trials, even with the pregnant animals. They didn't see any kinds of structural abnormalities, whereas in humans it was grossly harmful. And again, these harm particular structures at particular points in development. This is not something that it doesn't matter when you get this teratogen, it's going to cause the same outcome. It really has that issue of critical and sensitive periods. So there are some things that pregnant women can have at certain periods in development, and then if you had it at another period of development, we can have really bad repercussions. So again, we see differences depending on where we are in prenatal development, what is going on in prenatal development, the stages, the weeks that we're at. And this is, again, most typical effects are happening during these periods of rapid change. And that's, again, why I started this lecture talking about critical and sensitive periods, because this is when those teratogens are going to be most impactful, is during these periods of rapid change. Okay. So teratogens, again, can be any number of things. They can be drugs, legal and illegal drugs. So I'm not talking about just cocaine here. I'm also talking about ibuprofen. So again, this is both any kind of drug or medication can have teratogenic effects. Maternal disease. So we see there's some evidence that the flu can really, and depending on when women have the flu, when they're pregnant, can really heighten the risk for schizophrenia. So we're seeing that influenza may have some teratogenic effects in terms of mental health. Environmental pollutants. You are assigned to read the body burden from the Environmental Working Group. And that talks about the environmental pollutants of, in this case, seemingly healthy newborns. These are newborns that didn't have any major birth defects that were known. And the levels and the amounts and the kinds of chemicals that they were exposed to in utero. And so again, these environmental pollutants can be teratogens as well. Nutrition can be another thing that can affect prenatal development. It's not necessarily a teratogen, but it can have those same level of effects. It can either have massive deformities. It's more what you don't get, whereas teratogens, what you do get, can cause deformities. Nutrition is going to be what you don't get that can cause deformities. Maternal stress can actually be a contributing factor in these environmental influences on the developing organism. We talked about maternal age a little bit already, and we talked about prenatal care a little bit already as well. So we're really going to focus on the teratogens part of it. Okay, so the thing with teratogens is you can have the same defect caused by different teratogens. So you can have abnormalities, let's say, to the facial features, and it can be caused by alcohol, it can be caused by fetal alcohol syndrome, or it can be caused by another teratogen altogether. And that abnormality can look the same. It can present itself the exact same way. But again, it can be caused by different teratogens. There is a variety of defects that can happen from a single teratogen. So again, it's not this one-to-one relationship. This one teratogen can cause a wide range of deformities or a large range of defects. So we can have a variety of these from just one specific substance. Dose and exposure can really influence impact. So how much of this thing they were exposed to. So in the environmental working group study, these weren't women that were living, you know, in a toxic waste dump. So while they might have had some of the same chemicals, exposure to them, the levels were a lot lower, and so they didn't seemingly cause problems. Presence of other negative factors can worsen this. Teratogens plus poor nutrition can really make that teratogen more impactful and cause more deformities and more problems. Also, the quality of the postnatal environment really affects that long-term effect. So babies that are exposed to various drugs, again, this can be legal or illegal. Say cocaine, Prozac, both of those we can see that infants can be born with addictions to those. So the postnatal environment can really dictate those long-term effects. If those children are treated effectively immediately after birth and are given the environment that they need to kind of bounce back, a lot of times they can. But again, that quality of that environment after they're born is a very important piece of that too. The other thing is that teratogens don't just affect mothers. Teratogens affect fathers too. Granted, the timing of the teratogen is different. So teratogens are going to be more impactful or going to only be impactful for dads prior to conception. So this is going to be something that's going to affect the quality of the sperm itself. So we see that because men are continually making new sperm, different environmental impacts, drugs, things like that, can create sperm that are defective, that have these defects or have these chromosomal abnormalities that can then be passed on to the organism after conception. Again, moms are going to be most impacted during that prenatal phase, but there are some studies that are showing that things like nutrition, at least, before conception, as you guys read about in the epigenetics piece, can be impactful as well. Okay, so some of the drugs that we know are teratogens, both legal and illegal. We have alcohol, tobacco, nicotine, cocaine, aspirin, ibuprofen. So these are all things that have known teratogenic effects. Environmental hazards. The problem with this one is that a lot of times people are unaware of the presence of that. This can include lead, mercury, PCBs, radiation, any disease that passes through the placenta, HIV, rubella, syphilis. These can all really cause big effects on the developing organism. So again, each teratogen will affect specific aspects of prenatal development. So rubella is known to affect the eyes, ears, and heart, but the limbs are unaffected, okay? So it's really affecting certain areas of development, but not the entire organism. PCBs can affect the physicality is very normal, and this is a pesticide. The physicality of the organism will be normal, but we see long-term effect, such as below average memory and verbal development. So again, this is going to be something that's going to be more affecting the brain than it is going to be affecting the outward physical structures. And this one's going to be harder because that damage you're not going to really see till later in life. You don't know off the front that there's problems with memory and verbal until those skills really start to develop. And so the quality of the postnatal environment doesn't get an opportunity to be as supportive because this one's not always known. And this is just one example. Thalidomide was a prescription medication that was prescribed in the 1960s, and it was really used for women, sometimes with nerves, but mostly for nausea and morning sickness. And again, thalidomide had gone through drug studies, and with animal models, there were no defects reported, no problems. But in human samples, we were seeing major deformities in the arms and legs. So these children sometimes would have kind of more arm buds or arm legs than they would. They would have toes that were not in right places, fingers that were not in right places. They really had these gross deformities. And I don't mean gross in sort of, ew, yucky. I mean gross in terms of large. So we also saw less frequently, there was deformities with the ears, heart, kidneys, genitals. There was also sometimes cognitive impairments, and some of these deformities were so severe that the children didn't survive. So here's a picture of some children that were exposed to thalidomide. If you can see their arms, there's not much of them. Their legs were fully formed in these cases, but their arms were not. Here's another infant. You can see we have a toe where there shouldn't be a toe on this child's foot. And if you can kind of see, there's some arm deformities there as well. There's actually a TV show called Call the Midwife, and they actually do a pretty good job of talking about this and kind of using it as a way to kind of show how they didn't know this was going on, they didn't know what was happening, and kind of see it in the time period. So I believe that was in the last season, season 5, if you're interested in that. We also have DES, and this was used to prevent miscarriages in women. So this seems like a really helpful medication. The problem is the children that were born, the daughters in adolescence and adulthood had higher rates of vaginal cancer. They also had malformations to the uterus and often had infertility themselves. So while this medication helped their mothers carry them to term, there was big deformities internally, and there were issues with increased risk of cancer. So again, not all of these teratogens do we know their effects at birth. Do we know, oh, okay, this is what's happened? Sometimes these things aren't noticed until much later on. And so these were children that we didn't see these kinds of abnormalities until they were in adolescence and adulthood. Accutane is one of the medications that's used to treat severe acne. And in the first trimester, the exposure can cause really major abnormalities to the eyes, the ears, the skull, the brain, the heart, the immune system. So much so that that they will not prescribe this to teenage girls without them being on some sort of birth control because they are such big abnormalities, and also because this is first trimester. So a lot of times these things are happening before the individual even knows that she's pregnant. So a lot of times Accutane won't even be prescribed if that individual is not taking some sort of birth control. Aspirin can be known to cause low birth weight, infant death, poor motor development, and lower IQ. Caffeine, there's some indication that it's linked to lower birth weight and miscarriages. This is only in really great amounts. 1 cup of coffee a day, most doctors say is not a problem. Smoking or exposure to smoking. This is not just the mother smoking. This can also be secondhand smoke and even third-hand smoke. Third-hand smoke is when you're getting those things off of clothes or fabrics or in the environment, like off of walls and things like that. So there's not actively smoking going on right there, but those chemicals are still around. We can see low birth weight. We can see miscarriage. We can see prematurity. We can see impaired heart rate and breathing rate during sleep. infant death, asthma, cancer, cognitive impairments. Tobacco is one of the ones that I like to use as an example about how not every organism is affected by the same way. So my mom smoked with me for parts of her pregnancy. And I was born 10 pounds, 3 ounces. So clearly low birth weight was not a problem for my mother, nor was prematurity. That was not something that tobacco affected given my genotype and the genotype of my mother. I was 40 weeks and then had to be induced. So again, these things are not universally harmful, and that's sometimes the problem. We can say, oh, well, so-and-so, this happened to so-and-so, this happened to Dr. Atchison, her mom smoked with her and she was fine. But we don't know. It's not a one-to-one situation, and there's no way to know ahead of time whether these are going to be affected or not. So again, we really, with regard to all teratogens, we don't know the outcome beforehand. And so again, it is really important to just usually err on the side of caution. And that's what most doctors advise. And this is, again, where prenatal care can be very helpful because they can tell you what kind of things to avoid. Alcohol is clearly a teratogen as well. It can cause mental disabilities and fetal alcohol syndrome, which is what FAS stands for. Fetal alcohol syndrome, those in children tend to have facial abnormalities. You can see that this individual here has some facial abnormalities. His nose is broader. The space between his nose and his top lip is different shaped. Congenital heart disease can happen. Failure to thrive, which often can lead to infant death. There are behavioral problems associated with this, and this is going to be related to brain development. Same thing with learning disabilities. And again, the times at which alcohol is exposed to the developing organism also affect these things too. So you're not going to get facial malformations at 38 weeks. If mother's had a glass of wine or even a bottle of wine at 38 weeks, you're not going to get facial malformations or really big heart malformations. That's going to be something that's happening when alcohol exposure was early on. So again, timing is playing a big role in this as well. We know that alcohol is the leading cause of mental impairments and birth defects. In most communities, either about 1/2 to 3 in every 1,000 individuals are affected by fetal alcohol syndrome. And the problem with this is that it's 100% of preventable. Alcohol is not something it's a need, it's a want. And so this is something that really can be prevented. We see, again, fetal alcohol syndrome individuals with that have slower physical growth. They have smaller heads. They have different structures. The folds around their eyes is another place that will have malformations. Again, the bridge of the nose is a place we'll have facial abnormalities, eye openings, that flat mid-face. Again, that space between the nose and the top lip, the philtrum, a thin top upper lip, and an undeveloped jaw. These are just some of those facial abnormalities. So again, the short eyelids, thin philtrum. So to have this fetal alcohol syndrome, we need to have slow physical growth. We need to have at least 3 of these facial abnormalities, not necessarily all of them, but at least 3 of them, and some evidence of brain injury, so that there's been documented impairment in at least 3 areas for someone to be diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. Partial fetal alcohol syndrome is you have 2 of the 3 facial abnormalities. There's still evidence of that brain injury in at least 3 areas of functioning. And then we can have alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. And this, we still having those cognitive deficits, but not necessarily having some of those physical abnormalities. There's a really great website called, surprisingly, nofas.org, where there's a lot more information about this, and again, about ways that it can really be prevented. Illegal drugs. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reports that 4% of women take illegal drugs. This can result in low birth weight, prematurity, physical defects, breathing difficulties, infant death, addiction, and withdrawal. So again, these are really, really severe. And a lot of times those infant deaths can also be caused by the addiction and withdrawal. They can be carried to term, born live, and then there is the infant then dies afterwards because of the severity of the addiction and withdrawal. And again, things like low birth weight and prematurity are going to increase the risk of there being problems postnatally as well. Cocaine, we see that it creates defects in the eye, bone, genital and urinary tract, kidney, heart disease. It can cause brain hemorrhages in infants and seizures. We see these children often have slower growth and cognitive impairments. And again, these children are typically, especially if their mother was taking cocaine towards the end of the pregnancy, they are often born addicted themselves. And so then they will have to go through withdrawal as well, which can cause even more stress on that infant. Heroin or methadone. Methadone's not the legal, but the more legal version of heroin. These infants have lowered attention, slow motor development, and a lot of these deficits can really be long life for the entire life of the organism. Marijuana. We hear a lot about how marijuana is not as harmful as it was maybe once led to believe. However, it is still a teratogen. While it may not be harmful when you're not pregnant, it can still be harmful when you are pregnant. And this is both, and it can also affect fathers before conception as well. Marijuana is linked to smaller head size, and that's really a problem because head size is really a measure of brain growth. So that really is of concern. We also see that these children can have sleep, attention, and memory problems. So remember, I wanted you to go to this website. If you haven't already, please do so. The Environmental Working Group does really great stuff about the environment and chemicals in our environment. And it's a resource that I use personally in my life all the time, just to kind of regulate and to understand what kind of chemicals myself and my family are being exposed to. But this one is particularly about newborns, and they took the cord blood, so the blood that's in the umbilical cord of 10 newborn infants, and they tested it to see what kind of environmental pollutants were in it. And spoiler alert, they found a whole bunch. So please go and read through that. Obviously, I'm not going to test you on what was the 5 of the kinds of, environmental hazard. That's not happening. So I don't need you to know the specific substances that these children were exposed to, but really kind of broad strokes, take home messages, how many, these sorts of things, what were some of the side effects of that these are known to cause in humans. So those kinds of things. So please read this. And this is also involved in your participation assignment for this week. So remember, the impact of the teratogen really depends on the organism themselves. Okay, so again, my mom smoked with me, and I did not have low birth weight. I was not premature, and I would think that if I was able to get all the way through grad school, that my cognitive impairments were probably pretty minimal, if non-existent too. However, that does not mean that every organism has that same, be that lucky. We know that tobacco does cause those sorts of things. In the case of my mom, she was undiagnosed with hypoglycemia, which is a blood sugar disorder, which blood sugar disorders like diabetes are known to cause really big babies. So it may just be that the blood sugar of the organism, my mom and I, overrode whatever effect the tobacco could have had. So it really, again, it depends on that individual genotype and the constitution of each individual organism. Parents should discuss all drugs, medications, vitamins, herbal supplements with their prenatal care provider. There's some really great websites out there too that have information on medications and who they've been tested on, or have they been shown to be safe in humans during prenatal development, or is it just animal models? And there's really great websites that will tell you the different classes of these. Again, herbal supplements can be sometimes problematic. There's even things like chamomile tea. There's some evidence that there can be some greater risks of miscarriage with. So again, it really is important to talk to your individual healthcare provider, because they can help answer these questions on the basis of you instead of just the global whole. I personally just erred on the side of caution. If it was between maybe and no and yes, let's just go with we're not going to do it at all then. So there's always that can be a safe way to approach teratogens. But again, with teratogens in the environment, that really is something we all have to be concerned about as a whole too. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about nutritional deficiencies and malnutrition. So the consequences for this, one of which can be if you have a deficiency in folic acid, we see that this can cause spina bifida, which is a defect in the neural tube. So early on in prenatal development, remember that neural tube that it folds in on itself and it seals, and it seals that spinal cord in the spine and in the organism. Problem when that doesn't fully seal, that is caused by folic acid deficiency. So much so that if you look at your breads and your cereals, now they have folic acid added into them. And we've seen spina bifida rates go down dramatically since that the FDA has included that in the vitamins and the supplements that need to be added to the enriched products. So we've seen that go down dramatically because this is happening really early on in pregnancy. This is happening usually before people even know that they're pregnant. So again, that's one of the reasons why they've added it into the food source is just to help with that. Another one that's added into the food source that's really, really helpful is iodine. So the reason there is iodine in your salt is for brain development of developing children. It's good for the rest of us too, but it is really important for prenatal development, and it's really important for children's brain development as a whole. So again, we iodize salt for that. I was reading a book called Half the Sky, and it's talking about women in other countries and women empowerment, and they said one of the cheapest things that a country can do to really improve its country and improve things for women is to iodize salt, because iodine is important for both biological sexes, but it's even more important they see in developing girls. So this is another deficiency that can cause long-term kinds of damage. We can see malnutrition can cause low birth weight and prematurity. This is really especially bad because when infants are born premature, they will their lungs are one of the things that's underdeveloped, and so we can see long-term respiratory problems and also immune problems as well. We can also see malnutrition can cause learning problems and lower IQ scores later in development. Again, this can cause premature birth. And we also see a higher incidence of adult diabetes, hypertension, and other diseases. And this one really might be epigenetic. So if we think back to what we read about and learned about in terms of epigenetics, this is kind of telling the organism, developing organism, hey, there's not a lot of food around. You got to make the most of what food you're getting. And so then after the child is born, if that child is not getting adequate nutrition, if there is nutrition around, the body kind of overuses the nutrition that it's getting. There is especially some sensitive periods for malnutrition. The first trimester, malnutrition can cause miscarriage and along with physical defects. In World War II, the Netherlands was cut off from supply lines, and so there was a really big famine in World War II, and we saw lots of physical deformities, we saw miscarriages, and what's really interesting, just like you read about in the epigenetics section, this can also, it caused problems not just for the infants that were prenatal during the famine, but for their offspring as well. So there were some epigenetic links even that we can see in malnutrition. In the third trimester, we see smaller head and brain size. Again, a lot of what's happening in that third trimester is that brain is just really growing and preparing itself to be out in the world. And so when we're not getting proper nutrition in that third trimester, that's where we see a lot of the effects. Prevention. Again, adding that folic acid into the food stream has really cut spina bifida down dramatically. You'll see it's in pretty much all women's vitamins, multivitamins. It's definitely in all prenatal vitamins. We see calcium prevents maternal high blood pressure, which helps maintain a healthy pregnancy, and it also helps prevent premature birth. Magnesium and zinc reduces prenatal and birth complications. Remember, iodine prevents these mental retardations or mental deficiencies and stunted growth. And again, it really promotes brain development. So we see in both genders, but females particularly. Vitamin C, especially early in pregnancy, is really important for prenatal growth and birth weight. We see that some of these are even important for fathers prior to conception too. We see that vitamin C is really important for healthy sperm development as well. So again, nutrition can play a role kind of throughout the prenatal period, and it just kind of depends upon where you are in development as to what the kinds of outcomes are. So that concludes our video on teratogens and some of the environmental impacts on prenatal development. So I hope that was helpful. See you in class.